Thank you for joining us. I'm Tom Waite. You're watching a special edition of CBSN on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Tonight, we have an esteemed panel that we'll get to in just a few moments, who will talk about what's changed and what hasn't, what progress we made, what progress we still need to make. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first, CBSN LA's Rachel Kim took us across the Southland today to see who is remembering George Floyd and how they're doing it.
God, we pray that you use George Floyd as an opportunity, as a lightning rod, for us to reimagine and come together and rethink how we treat each other.
In Leimert Park, civil rights leaders, clergy, and community members prayed and took a knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds in memory of George Floyd on the first anniversary of his death. Local clergy said it has caused communities everywhere to take a closer look at what's going on closer to home.
And when I look across the landscape of South Los Angeles and see how African American men are being shot and killed at alarming rates, we have to stand on the principle that black lives really do matter.
Earlier in the day in downtown LA, activists were energized by the solidarity, but also solemn as they remembered George Floyd and the other black lives lost in the last year.
In my generation, it was Emmett Till, but there's been one every generation. We want to stop that.
Last summer, thousands filled the streets to protest police violence. Today, activists say they've already made real progress in Los Angeles, helping pass Measure J to direct more funds to address racial injustice and getting LAUSD to reallocate some of their school police budget. But they're hopeful that real systematic changes will be made.
There is still the energy, there's still the support, but we want more of it. And so part of why we continue to be part of these movements and gatherings and is to say that we're not going anywhere. And yes, to rally the people to come back out and get in the streets, because the work is out here in the streets.
What I would tell you is that the conversations and changing how we do policing and bringing the heart of the community into that conversation is happening in a very real way. And I believe in the coming weeks, not coming months, in the coming weeks, we're going to see some of that manifest.
Mr. Saucedo also says he's thankful for the mobilization of people of all races, people of all ages, city officials and law enforcement officials who are willing to come together and work together towards a common goal. Reporting from Hollywood, Rachel Kim, CBSN Los Angeles.
Joining us tonight on our panel, Chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, Michael Moore, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascón, USC law professor Jody Armour, clinical psychologist Adolph Brown, Pastor Shep Crawford from Experienced Christian Ministries of Los Angeles Police Protective League General Counsel Robert Rico, and police procedure expert Timothy Williams Jr. And again, thank you so much to everyone who's joining us tonight. We also invited a member of Black Lives Matter to be represented here tonight. They told us, quote, BLM LA does not serve on panels with police. So here we have an amazing group of people to talk about what's happened in the past year. I'm going to send it over to our main anchor, Pat Harvey, to open our discussion. Hi, Pat.
Hi there, Tom. Thanks so much. And to all of our panelists, thank you so much for being here this evening, and of course to our viewers who are tuning in. Chief Moore, I'd like to begin with you. Bit of bad news. From what we understand in the latest reporting, crime is up 200% from last year in Los Angeles. A bit of good news. You have been encouraged because the city budget is going to be increased for your department. So all that said, I'd like you to correct the record if you want to, but also ask you, has the LAPD made any changes in policing since the death of George Floyd and the calls for reform?
Pat, well, thank you. First of all, let me correct the record. Crime is not up 200% in Los Angeles. We actually see a crime reduction in property crime and in a number of our violent crime areas. Where we are seeing challenges that began last year and has continued in this year is shooting violence. The number of homicides in Los Angeles did increase from just over 250 homicides last year to, in 2019, more than a decade of less than 300 homicides in the city of 4 million to 355. And we also saw a substantial increase in the number of shooting victims. And this year, that pace has continued. We have a 22% increase in homicides this year. That's 22 additional homicides this year versus last. And we have 220 additional shooting victims. When we look at the underlying influences of that, we believe that it's involving street violence and many times involving members who identify themselves as gang involved, as well as persons experiencing homelessness. We think the pandemic has been a tremendous influence on this, too many guns and too many hands. But more important, and as we work through that, and our focus is in reducing violence in our community and saving lives and working that in a shared responsibility with all the partners, including some that are on this panel here tonight. What has changed this last year in Los Angeles has been quite a bit. I'm proud of the Los Angeles Police Department and its historic strides in reform and being a 21st century policing agency. But yet we all look back and reflect today, a year ago, when we saw the terrible images coming out with the murder of George Floyd. And even though at the time we looked at that with disgust, we also recognized the reckoning that came from it in the days and weeks afterwards. And the calls for not just the reforms that have been achieved here in Los Angeles, but to quicken the pace of the evolution of those reforms and the progress needed. I'm proud of the work led by Mayor Garcetti, endorsed by our city council, and then implemented under the leadership of our police commission to tighten up our use of force strategies, to tighten up our policies in regards to duty to intervene, to ban the chokehold, to ensure that our officers render aid. We ended last year with 27 officer-involved shootings, the second lowest number of officer-involved shootings in more than 30 years. And yet we know that 27 are still too many, and that the loss of life at the hands of police, oftentimes defending themselves, and we've got to find a better way of policing the city. That's why I'm encouraged by the call to action to find alternative ways of responding to non-emergency matters of dispute, particularly involving mental health, typically involving disputes at a local level that don't require a police officer. I look forward to this coming year, seeing those services brought to bear, and then allowing the department to pull back out of activities that many times do not produce the types of results that the community or the police are satisfied with.
All right, well, Chief, you've already mentioned a few things that have been brought up in terms of reforms. I'm going to mention the George Floyd Policing Act nationally. So what you're saying is LAPD has actually already had some of those reforms even before this particular act was called for. I'm going to get back to you on that, but I want to make sure all the panelists have a chance to speak before we do our follow-up questions. So I'm going to go to you, Mr. DA, George Gascón. You know, you were elected by voters primarily because they didn't approve of former DA Jackie Lacey's what they call lack of action in terms of actually bringing, prosecuting who they consider abusive police officers. And now there is a recall by victim rights advocates against you, saying that you are prioritizing criminals over victims. And not my words, obviously, but I want you to respond to that and ask you how you're going to fight back.
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, Pat, the reality is that the day after I was sworn in, some of the people that campaigned against me aggressively immediately started talking about a recall, right? The people wanted to go back and have this election all over again. You know, this was an election that was really a parting of the waters for our community as to the philosophical approach to how do we reach security and safety and public health in our communities. And there were two distinct ways of doing business, and with my predecessor in what I'm bringing to the table. But, you know, to say that I am anti-victim, it really neglects the fact that I've been involved in public safety all my life. You know, about 30 years in policing, 10 years as a district attorney. I'm very committed to safety in our community and to treating victims with respect and dignity. But as the people's lawyer, which is what the prosecutor is, my job is not only to protect one victim today, but it's also to look for protecting our entire community, to make sure that we're reducing the number of victims in the future, and also to understand that the accused is also part of our community and they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. I think that one of the problems that people are forgetting, and especially those that are attacking me, is that we have a system that has been embedded in systemic racism for generations, really since the origins of this country. And we have, you know, the George Floyd incident was really a culmination for many in America to see what many of us have known that has been going on for a very long time. And that really led to my election. The issue of police accountability is certainly one major component. It's one major component of why I got elected, but it's a broader spectrum of things. It's how we're going to police our communities in the future. How do we deal with violence? How do we deal with low-level offenses? How do we deal with juveniles, with people that are mentally ill? And that different way of thinking that I brought to the table is what we're talking about. And I'm very proud to say that actually working with Chief Moore, we're beginning to address violence through a very different lens. We're looking at 3 different LAPD divisions as a beginning of a process where we're taking a public health approach to dealing with violence. We're bringing in the county public health department. We're bringing other partners in the community, as well as the police and the prosecution, and trying to walk the entire spectrum of solutions from prevention to intervention, and obviously, when appropriate, arrest and prosecution.
All right, Mr. Gascón. Well, Tom, we have heard time and time again that most of the other commentary surrounding not just police activity, many people feel that it should center around public health in the communities. And that seems to be what has happened in terms of money from the American Rescue Plan that they have given to the city of Los Angeles to donate to various groups to help in that effort.
Absolutely. And I think also, and along those lines, I kind of wanted to get a sense from Professor Armour, who studies racial justice so closely, who has been so focused on this. I'm curious, over the course of the past year, what are you seeing? What on the ground when you speak to people about this movement and the changes? Do people feel like they have seen incremental change, or do they really feel like this movement may be born out something completely different, something bigger?
Yeah, this is for LA been a real resounding example of the success of grassroots activism and embracing an entirely different conception of justice, one not rooted in retribution, retaliation, and revenge, but rather in restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation. And you saw that when we saw the voters go to the polls in November, and in response to the protesters roiling the streets of LA for 6 weeks in a row, we saw them not only oust a traditional law and order, tough on crime prosecutor, Jackie Lacey, who said, wrapped herself in her social identity and said, I'm the first Black woman, DA, and vote for me for that reason. But instead, many looked at the substance of her policy, said they've led us down the wrong road for too long, and elected Gascón. And then Measure J, 10% of the unrestricted funds of the county budget, and that budget can be up to $10 billion a year. So that's up to $1 billion a year for incarceration and police alternative, right, from the voters. So I think one of the real stories here is the way that the people of California have embraced a new way of looking at justice and a new way of trying to think about crime and punishment.
Pastor Shep, I want to bring you in this conversation. Do you feel the same way? I'm going to speak for some people who look at this and say, we've been here before. We've been here in 1992, and here we are again facing some of the same problems. However, this seems to be a much different movement. Well, it has been a much different movement than we've seen in the past, probably one of the biggest movements that we've seen since the civil rights movement in the 60s. Can you echo what Professor Armour has said, and what are you hearing and feeling from your community?
Yes, thank you. From the streets perspective, it is frustrating. We have been here before. I think that we are encouraged a little bit more because the George Floyd incident caught the eye of white America. And white America finally figured out what we mean when we say Black Lives Matter. And when that happened, I think that took a turn. It still is frustrating because, we're dealing with situations or organizations, particularly when it comes down to law enforcement, that started off as an organization to keep Black people in check. And so it's difficult to build that relationship. I must say that my working with Chief Moore and having those conversations with him and a few other officers that I've been involved with have changed my perspective and have given me hope. In my hope, I get frustrated, and it is team members that remind me that I have to continue to be at the table. I'm not expecting it to change in my time. But I'm hoping that my son will be able to once I'm gone, or his son, that I'm doing my part in making sure that we build relationships. And that is the thing. I've seen it work in the South Park community where my church is, where there is relationships between what we would call OG or ex-gangbangers and the law enforcement. And it's because they know each other by name. They've sat in the park and have talked and have given their different perspectives. And so our job is to make it better. Better is our goal, to end where we are right now and to take it to a place that we want it to be. Is not going to happen in our time, I don't believe, but it can be better. And as long as it can be better, we have to sit at the table.
And Dr. Brown, how can we have dialogue? You know, I listened to Pastor Shep talking about his communications with Chief Moore. Do we need more of that? Are people able to really listen to one another, even if they appear on both sides of an issue, and really come together for the good of the community and for the police? Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility, particularly when we take emotion out of it. I don't think I've watched a talk show or anything over the last year and a half that hasn't been sensationalized. I think one of the things that Pastor Shep talked about is not experiencing this in his lifetime. And I think we have to address that for everyone. And the fact that it's systemic, the fact that many of us immediately say, you know, how can we heal? That's the problem. You're blaming the victim when you say, how can we heal? How is it that Black people can heal when we're injured every single day? So you're talking about healing when the injury is still occurring. And it's really important that we stop saying, how do we heal? And we say what Chief Moore said earlier, moving from here. How do we move from here? I mean, we think about an injury that a person gets from working out, just a sprained ankle or something. I mean, one of the ways that we recover from that is giving it rest. Tell me when Black people have had rest in America. So that's the issue that Pastor Shep is really talking about. And the fact of the matter is, we say in this country, when extreme atrocities happen, we say things like, we're going to ensure that that never happens again. Yet we're here again. We're MLK, Malcolm, Reverend Jackson, and the list goes on. We're here again. So we have to acknowledge what it is. It's this system that we're not addressing. And Chief Moore, we have to remember that in any profession, you know, we have people that work and give 100%, but we also have those that aren't a good fit, whether it's medicine, whether it's clergy, whether it's education, mental health. We have people that aren't a good fit. So we have to remember, when it comes to law enforcement is not an exception. We will have people within law enforcement who aren't a good fit, and they have to be removed. So that's a start.
Tom?
I was going to ask Robert Rico if you could chime in on this, being a member and general counsel of the Police Protective League. When police officers are hearing these messages from the community, how is it internalized? Do people see it constructively? Are they trying to build on it? And how do you communicate with your members about the need for change and sometimes institutional or structural change in the ranks?
And I agree with Dr. Brown. And to answer your question in regards to the reform, and to answer your question, our members are frustrated because, as the chief laid out, the LAPD and our union and the city of Los Angeles have been at the forefront of reform for decades. And we have collectively set the standard nationwide in regards to transparency, policies that deal with use of force. I can tell you right now, as Dr. Brown said, we agree that officers who are committing egregious acts shouldn't be police officers. That's why we have set forward, we as the union and our board of directors has set forward a national standard on use of force. We've spoken to U.S. senators and congressmen regarding these standards, and we set forward true reform. And Pat Harvey mentioned the Justice Act. What we found with the Justice Act is it's time for reform, but it doesn't give us reform. We need change, and change means do what we're doing in Los Angeles. Have an early intervention system. We call it teams in Los Angeles. Identify officers who may be having issues early on. Maybe it's personal, or maybe it's professional. In Los Angeles, we track traffic accidents, use of force, complaints, and we put it into an algorithm, and we try to figure out officers that may be having problems. And so we're asking on a nationwide standard to set forward true reforms. The current Justice Act does a lot of research and get back in 2 years. It talks about studying things. The time for studying is over. And we've proven that in California with AB 392 and SB 230 that were passed last year, where we have a use of force standard. And what we're calling for is a national use of force standard, early intervention systems, national duty to intervene, the Los Angeles Police Department and the policy set forth by the chief. We have the duty to intervene. We need it nationally. It's not a hard concept. And so a national police registry, bad apples shouldn't go on to other agencies. But what we need some definition, and we need a registry that has officers that have committed serious misconduct and have been terminated to be in that registry. True reform, and people that are looking at true reform don't care about officers that have been involved in a traffic accident and got suspended, or for example, they were late, they have a tardiness issue or an attendance issue. True reform calls for a national registry that has officers that have committed gross misconduct, and defining that's tough, but more than just the average day-to-day misconduct. And that's what we're calling for. We've actually gotten the ear of Congress, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to have true reform, and the officers that do commit those types of acts shouldn't be police officers. Police work, the policing is, we call it a profession. And when you have a profession, you have a set of ethics. We have a code of ethics. But you also have, if you look at nurses, you look at doctors, you look at lawyers, if you're a nurse in California and you go to another state and you want to practice nursing, there's a set of national standards that you have to abide by. If you're a nurse in Iowa, if you're a nurse in California, it doesn't matter. We're asking for a national use of force standard so that, for example, if you're a use of force investigator in California, you could do the same investigation in Iowa, Macon, Georgia, anywhere in the United States, because the standard is a national standard, and that's what needs to be done. We need true reform, and it does not need to be a lot of talk, which is what we believe most of what the Justice Act pretends to be, and we need things to be done now, not studied, and don't come back to us in 2 years. Do it now. We've done it in California, and we're asking at a federal level for them to do it federally.
All right. You know what? That sounds really a lot that is involved in the George Floyd Policing Act on the national level, to have some kind of federal mandate for all departments of law enforcement. I'd like to bring in Mr. Williams in this conversation. Sir, we have seen time and time again, which is really probably why we are here today, in terms of abuse of force, excessive force, deadly force played out on TV screens across the nation, certainly in the case of George Floyd. A lot of people ask, what is the policy, Mr. Williams, in terms of use of force? Just how much should be done? How much should be given? Is there, and for a traffic stop, for example, what is the policy involved, and why are we seeing so much brutality across our screens?
Well, I'm retired from LAPD. I remember George Gascón when he came, and when he was on the department, and Michael Moore as well. I did almost 30 years with the department, and the thing is that I have cases all across the country, and the use of force. Well, the standard is you use that force which is necessary. to effect arrest and to stop resistance. Even the California Penal Code on 835 APC talks about that as well. And there are Supreme Court decisions that lay that out. In California, you have different areas of use of force. In Northern California, you have a sheriff's department that has banned the use of the carotid hole. And then you come further south, then we have departments that use the carotid hole. So there is a patchwork work as it relates to use of force, pretty much all across the country. And I agree with Mr. Rico, is that there's got to be a standard. It has to come from the federal side. It's got to be uniform all across the country. I've handled cases from California to New York, or to the New England states, and everything is different as it relates to use of force. And again, we have to have a standard. And the thing is that, I was around when Rodney King, and the same discussion we had back in 1992, we're having today.
Yes.
And the same anger that was there is here today. 29 years later, nothing has been accomplished. And we have to quit talking about it and be about it. And that's the issue. I've been in this business a little bit over 47 years, and I've seen a lot, and I haven't seen a lot.
I was going to say one issue that we're seeing, I think this week or just the past few days, is this horrific video from Louisiana of Ronald Green, this horrific situation. I'm curious. I hear a lot from our panel that there, obviously there's been progress made, but when we see a video like this from 2019, and Pastor Crawford, maybe I'll throw this one to you first, because we were talking last night about you talking to your congregation about, no, there is progress. Look, there's talk being given between me and the police chief, and you're trying to reassure your members, but then you see this video come out of Mr. Green. How do you help your congregation understand that maybe there has been progress, even though we still see these body cam videos surfacing?
Well, the negative is winning because there's more of that, right? So we're not just dealing with LAPD, we're dealing with law enforcement. And so we are at the point that we're so tired and hurt that anything law enforcement does on the negative sense, we charge it to all law enforcement. And we just say law enforcement, and rightfully so. But it is the work that's been going on for the last year, in the progress that's been made, in the strides that we are talking about as it relates to getting more clergy, getting more faith-based clergy involved, and when it relates to training and different efforts of progression. And I think that when I'm speaking particularly to my young adults, because my young adults are the ones that say, uh-oh, here comes Pastor Chef, he messing with the po-pos again, you know what I mean? And I have to tell them that, as a pastor, I have to sit at that table. This is something that Jesus would do. This is something that MLK did, and he, of course, received criticism for it, and understandably. But at the end of the day, there is no other option at this point. If there was, I would be willing. I would be willing to entertain that. But right now, it is trying to definitely make it better. It gets disheartening when we see videos like this. And I was explaining to someone, it's difficult because if I meet a Chief Moore and I meet a Sergeant Kenji, and I know, from my conversations that they really want peace. I really believe they want peace. But then I see a video not only of a officer beating one of us, but other officers standing around and watching it. You say it's more than just a bad apple. The whole bunch is a bad apple. And I can't fight that. I can't even disagree with it because I know a few that I believe are different. But those few that I believe are different in LAPD are in leadership. So my hope is is that we can make it better. So it's hard, it's difficult. I get upset myself and want to leave the table. And I'm just reminded that, Pastor Shupp, you cannot leave that table. As long as they are inviting you to talk, you have to be there to have that conversation.
You know, I was here in 1992 as well during the Rodney King riots, and I remember the Christopher Commission. And honestly, I thought there was a period of time when things were going better in terms of relationships with the LAPD and the people of the community. I mean, we're able to rebuild back Los Angeles. And then we find ourselves back in a situation that even may be more ominous. So, Chief, I want to ask you, I know it's very difficult because you're talking about your force. We're talking about the blue code. When I hear duty to intervene, that means other officers speaking up without fear of retribution from their fellow officers to report something that they see may be untoward. And there are those officers who do follow the code and have done community policing and try to get to know the community members better. I mean, we can't, to me, I would be remiss if we didn't mention that. I know those things have happened, but what turned this around in the other direction, and what can you do to right it? And what efforts are being made to right it?
So I agree. I think first of all, we find ourselves in this last year in reflection in the midst of a pandemic that no one had ever seen in any of our lifetimes. And it impacted every institution, every stabilizing factor in our society. And at the same time, we're presented with the imagery of a murder of a man at the hands of law enforcement in a place thousands of miles away, and the callousness nature of how that officer kneeled on that man's neck for 9.5 minutes. And and law enforcement recognized how much trauma that would bring about, and recognized also that it wouldn't just be a healing. There'd be a process of grief, absolute demands for change and acceleration. And this is an opportunity for us to lead from the front. Part of that is in part recognizing that we have come far. When we talk about the 90s, I was a sergeant in 1992 and was here during the Rodney King the civil unrest and the riotous conditions and the loss of life. And in the days after, Pat, you recognize the establishment of community policing, American policing as a standard, as a new philosophy, getting away from the professional model and recognizing that we have to partner, we can't just be problem solver, telling people how things are fixed. We got to work with them so that we work together. Well, in those early days, we still had 100 officer-involved shootings and more every year. The loss of life at many times in officers in defending themselves occurred. Over 1,000 murders in the city of Los Angeles, a much smaller city of Los Angeles. And while this last year, we have seen crime levels increase, particularly violent crime. They're back, and we've lost a decade of our crime reduction in our violence, but the whole ship is not lost. And we've got to at some point acknowledge that there has been change and reform. If we truly believe, and we're going to bring our men and women together, men and women who weren't alive in the 1992 riots and civil unrest. They weren't even born yet, but yet they're now the front lines in streets all around Los Angeles and America. And they're facing anger, frustration, grief by people who also weren't here in 1992, but their families were, and people that they know and people they've lost in the last 30 years at times at the hands of police. And all this comes together to a perfect time that now we're at this moment, and what do we do? I think we recognize what we've done. Don't be so proud of it that we ignore that there's more change and more evolution of policing that needs to occur. And that's our commitment in LA. Our sixth value is quality through continuous improvement. We are always going to lean forward. This last year, I'm proud of this organization because it hasn't done what it did in 1992. It didn't start fighting, arguing, debating that the actions in every instance was right. Instead, we recognized while our men and women stood tall and they did their best, and some of them fell short, and some of us in leadership positions fell short for them. We're committed to a path going forward of the evolution. And you're right. We can never say, how do we make sure that this never happens again? But we can never be satisfied with the status quo. That's the tenor of Los Angeles Police Department. That's our relationship, our engagement, our shared responsibility. And this means that we're all in this together. I'm very disappointed that tonight there wasn't an additional panel member here for us to come down, have a conversation, and continue to agree. Where do we go tomorrow morning when the sun comes up? What's the future of the safety of Los Angeles? And I recognize that you're asking a question about American policing. Let me be clear. 17,000 police agencies plus in this country. The vast majority of them have fewer than 50 officers. Many of them have fewer than 25 officers. Some of those are part-time. And those officers move from agency to agency with little regard to training, to their personnel background, disciplinary history. And one of those instances in a city near or far goes on the television and immediately it impacts LAPD. We're calling this, the law enforcement is calling major city chiefs, International Association of Chiefs of Police. We're calling for the reforms that are many aspects of the George Floyd bill. I've spoken personally with Representative Bass. Her heart and our heart and law enforcement are in the same place. None of us want a bad cop, and none of us want to see another agency hire someone that we fired because he or she is unfit to wear this badge.
All right, I wanted to ask a question about picking up on what Chief Moore has said. And listening to all of you, it does sound to me, just in terms of what that National Policing Act represents, that you're in agreement with it, and you obviously even maybe submitted of some of your thoughts for change that you'd like to see. One of the aspects in that bill, I believe, is racial sensitivity training for more officers in the community. Do you, and this is for anybody out there, do you agree that that would help? Just like, you learn something new every year. You might have to go back to learn a new technique for practically any career or any job that you have. Does it make sense? Go ahead.
If I can respond to that briefly, I think that that the bias training, what you talk about is bias training, needs to be reinforced, triply reinforced in the arena of law enforcement. It was disheartening when I heard a union, a law enforcement union, state during the insurrection that we don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. And that bothers me. When I came on the department, we had they call it cultural awareness day. And they had a black doing it, then throughout the years, and they had a white doing it. And then they went from there to videos. Now, how can you have bias training when you look at a video and they sign off on it and you go about your business? You got to take it seriously. If you don't take it seriously, then it's not going to be done. Number one. Number two, we talk about reform. Reform has to start from the front end. You got to get the right people on the job. And the thing is a lot of individuals who are doing background checks are the ones who've been on the department, retired police officers. So I call them gatekeepers. They're gatekeepers. So you're getting the same mentality in the department that should not be in the department. You got to come in with core values. I remember I was testifying in Florida on a case. The DA asked me, "Well, Mr. Williams, LAPD gave you your core values, is that right?" And I almost cursed. I says, "No. My mother and father gave me my core values. LAPD didn't give me nothing. I brought my core values to LAPD, and that's what it is. You can't wait for an organization to give you your core values. You got to come in with them." And the thing is that no one is talking about this stuff. You got to be very serious about this bias, and you got to be very serious who you bring on the department. We have all this discussion that's being talked about. Everything's being talked about this qualified immunity, but no one is talking about how you're going to bring people in, to bring the right people in. And until you have that discussion, reform is all it's going to be is a talk. I listened to George Gascón's lecture about a month ago, and what he was trying to do. I get it what he's trying to do in the DA's office, but there's an element who does not want change. We're back in the 50s in law enforcement as far as the mentality goes. And this is 2021.
Oh,
You know,
Mr.
we have to
Gascón, would you
also-
like to respond to what Mr. Williams has said in terms of the efforts that you see necessary and what you're trying to do as DA here?
Pat, while we're waiting for George, you mind if
I got it.
Oh, there you go, George.
I'm sorry. Yeah. You know, I agree with Mr. Williams. And I have to say this. Look, I commend the LAPD for the work that they're doing. I commend Chief Moore. I think part of the problem is I don't see the system necessarily as broken. I think that we really have to begin to start rethinking the way the system works. The system was really designed, and this is not just police officers, right? The system was designed to incarcerate large numbers of people. You have to go back to the origin of it. You know, you have to go back to slavery, quite frankly, and look at the origins of policing in this country. And then you get through the history of this country, and we have created a system within the criminal legal system that was really designed to oppress and to incarcerate large numbers of Black people. Police officers are only part of that machinery. We have to start thinking about the way that we do our work. That's one of the reasons why and this is based on science, by the way, this is not George Gascón, looking at violence through the lens of public health. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be a police and the prosecution intervention when it's appropriate, but it's looking at violence through a public health lens. We need to rethink the value of incarceration. We need to rethink the value of police and prosecution intervention, especially with low-level crimes and the early criminalization of young people that creates more crime in the future. And then when you add to that, that racism is alive and well in this country. We cannot walk away from racism, right? And that is not generated by police officers, by the way. That's the way our society is. Those are prosecutors, they're doctors, they're teachers, you can walk into any walk of life. So then we have to create systems that will ensure that we will deal with the human condition of race and push it out and not allow that to be the driving force behind our behavior. Because when we are acting upon the racist nature of our society, which is there, we continue to have the problems that we have. So policing often is only a reflection of everything else that is going on. Do we need to hold police accountable? Of course we do. Do we have to make sure that we get rid of the bad apples? Of course we do. Do we need to have more people like Chief Moore working with the community? All of things are yes, yes, yes. But we have to go beyond that. And I'm telling you something, as someone that ran training for the LAPD after the consent decree, someone that was on the streets during the 1992 riots, it's more than training. It's more than sensitivity. It's a lot more than that. It's more than diversity in the force. We have seen that we brought in the LAPD, we led the way, bringing in more Black and more brown officers. That didn't necessarily alter the outcome. You go back to last year, I was crying for a while. I could not believe when I saw some of the force that was being used by Southern California law enforcement, including the LAPD. And I'm saying, this is the stuff that we talked about years ago that we would not do again. And we were doing it. Now, I understand, I'm not indicting the entire police force, but the reality is these things continue to happen way too often. And they're happening not only because of the officers themselves, they're happening because the entire system allows for that to flourish.
All right, Mr. Gascón, I understand that you're going to have to leave us. So I wanted to give you a chance to have your comment there. That's a good question, gentlemen, just in terms of consistency, creating systems that makes things better, rethinking what we're doing. Again, is that a possibility?
Let me,
Mr. Rico, can you answer? Oh, go ahead, Chief. I'm sorry.
Pat, if you'd let, I think it's absolutely system-based, and many aspects of what George is talking about. LAPD has been the early interventions. Teams is what Mr. Rico indicated. This is an early intervention system that monitors officers' conduct, at-risk behavior, to see those that are hitting the guardrails, if you will, as an effort to correct. That bore out from the consent decree when we saw actions of officers go unchecked during the 90s. That evolution has been part of our success in reducing the types of violent encounters that we're talking about here today. Has it eliminated it? No. But the other accountability systems and development of our personnel, training based where we train as teams. The way we bring officers on is they're not independents, they're not John Waynes or Jane Waynes, they work as a team. Training that involves members from the community that come in and work with us in the development of and delivery of training. So officers are listening to members from communities throughout Los Angeles to hear their perspective. We hire 22, 25, 30-year-old individuals, and they come from all parts of Los Angeles, but they don't know all parts of Los Angeles. And our training today is sensitizing them that when you're working in, let's say, South Los Angeles, here are some of the challenges. Here's a history of 39th and Dalton. 39th and Dalton, everyone in that community well understands the absolute dark days of LAPD 30 plus years ago, but those officers rolling in are wearing the same uniform that the atrocities of 39th and Dalton represent. And so today we recognize that yes, the delivery of the training is important, but taking a step back and understanding systematically, how do we go about this to keep lasting reform? And that's been our lesson this last year. We have some of the best recruit-based training in American policing. We lead the country on that. However, our in-service training, once an officer is out of the academy, what happens for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Mr. Williams can attest to this. Once you make detective, we'd send you to detective school. But other than that, you seldom, if ever, received in-person hands-on training. And training in law enforcement is a perishable skill, and one that we are learning. And what we're asking our public officials for is to rethink law enforcement that invests in its people every day.
Tom, I've heard that from people that have called, that have written. And, we've been talking about images on television, and we neglected to mention social media. Let's not forget that. We're talking about retraining, something that should be ongoing in every aspect. Tom, I'm also wondering about what Chief Moore said earlier in terms of some of the officers really are going out on calls that they may not necessarily have to be going out on in terms of mental health issues. I know in the city of Berkeley, they've taken traffic enforcement from the police department to free them up to do other things. And I'm just wondering how anybody, Tom, if you can ask how people on the panel feel about that. Well, that's something that's feasible.
Yeah, and along those lines, Pat, I actually, Chief Moore talked about this on CNN yesterday. I was watching you talk about the mental health issues and how you are a firm believer in spending and investing more in getting the ability to have different people respond to those crises. I wanted to ask Mr. Rico, though, just kind of Pat was touching on this earlier. When we were talking about the George Floyd case, we also are talking about, of course, the officer who held him on his neck for more than 9 minutes, but there were also other officers there. How do you train other officers in those situations to recognize when somebody in charge, like Officer Chauvin was, to stop him? I mean, clearly he murdered George Floyd. We all know that now. He's been convicted. How do you train other officers? I'm just curious, Mr. Rico, maybe you can answer this, to recognize when there's a crisis situation and they need to intervene.
It starts with policy and training, and that's what I touched on earlier. And the chief has emphasized the duty to intervene. LAPD has a policy, and you reinforce that. And what you have to do, furthermore, is take out the fear of an officer of potential retribution. The problem is, in some cases, is recognizing what would be, and I quote, a clear act of excessive force, which is some of the language that's used in the current bill at the state level. As an officer, you could come up on a call. You don't know what the reasonable suspicion for the stop was, what the probable cause for the attempted arrest, why the altercation use of force started, and you come up and you see an officer involved in use of force. You don't know at that time what you have, so you don't know if the use of force being applied is excessive or not. There are cases, and we have a recent case, and I won't go into specifics, but we had an officer who saw what he believed to be an excessive use of force or use of force without a policy, and he immediately intervened. And so It's a testament to the policy at LAPD. It's a testament to the training. And going back to what Mr. Williams said, I just want to point out that, and Chief, correct me if I'm wrong on the dates, but I believe in 2017, every single officer in the Los Angeles Police Department went through implicit bias training, and so did the union. Our directors attended those meetings. I attended those meetings, and it was an eye opener. I was also at City Hall when the professor from University of Irvine or UCI spoke, and so the frustrating part is our officers are being led by Chief Moore, who's a true leader. And I say that because his leadership has trickled down to the commanders and captains, and it's reinforced to the officers. The expectations to follow policy and be held accountable has really trickled down. And so going back to what Mr. Williams said, Mr. Williams, I'm just as frustrated as you are. There's an old saying that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're going to be on the table. And our union is the only law enforcement union in the country that has met with Karen Bass, that has met with Senator Rice, that has met with Ambassador Rice, the point person for President Biden on this issue, on the Justice Act. And we're proud of that. And the reason we're at the table is because we have taken a leadership role in calling out what is bad policing, the reforms that need to be done, the training that needs to be done. And when you talk about training, you got to talk about funding. One of the issues that we put forward to Congress was we need funding for cities to train. As the chief said, these smaller agencies don't get funding. So the funding needs to be there. We're proud of our membership. We're proud of what has gone on in Los Angeles Police Department. It's sad that this Louisiana issue, I'm not familiar with it, and issues like the George Floyd murder have had serious consequences on the LAPD, where our officers during the protest and the violence that occurred took rocks, bricks, frozen water bottles, bottles filled with urine and feces for something that happened outside of this jurisdiction. The calls for reform from the entities that are not on this call that were invited, we've already, I can't say we, the chief has already implemented and we've supported. We've taken, this union and the board of directors has taken a true leadership role nationwide in attempting to put forward true reform. And so it's sad that an issue that occurs 2,000 miles away in Minnesota has a long-lasting effect on Los Angeles, but we support true reform and we're ready to embrace it.
If I can add,
Dr. Brown, was that
yeah,
Pastor Shep who was trying to talk?
One quick thing is that, and I agree with Rico, is that you got to have the right people at the table. Chief, you've heard this throughout your career, stakeholders. You got to bring the stakeholders to the table. And they may not agree with what you're thinking, but they're still stakeholders that need to be brought to the table. And until the true stakeholders are brought to the table, and you have talks away from the cameras in a room, leaving all your status at the door, and have some serious talk, then you will see some reform. I'm sorry, Pat.
No, that's okay. And Mr. Williams, I wanted to pick up on what you said earlier. You said, I don't think I'm going to see change in my lifetime. So I wanted to ask Dr. Brown, how do you talk to our sons and daughters, our grandchildren, if we have them, about change, about that possibility? And when we talk about, Mr. Williams, when you mentioned images and I brought up social media, those are our kids and our grandkids that see these images all the time. What do you say to them in terms of, I don't want to just say hanging in there, but what can they do and how can we convince them that, there is possibility?
First of all, the fact that you're even saying talk to them, that's paramount. There was one time that this issue was actually the elephant in the room. Now these issues are the room. So not to talk to children about this will kind of show that you aren't serious about it, that you aren't acknowledging it, or you're in denial. So, everyone was talking tonight about bad apples. So as we wait as adults for reform from the White House and the state houses, let's do something personally. Let's focus on our own houses, your house, my house. And in doing that, we talk about bad apples. Bad apples don't occur out of nowhere. They come from trees. I'm a parent of 8 children. So there are 8 apples in my home that I'm responsible for as they leave and go out into the world to become engineers, as they go out to become epidemiologists, professors, and other things that they already are. However, what did I do to shape that? Also, another thing, when we talk about the feelings of the people, particularly children, one of the first words that come out of our mouths is anger. Let's be very careful. I've been doing implicit bias training for over 30 years. My dissertation is on African-American males' perception of law enforcement. I've been doing this a long time. You say anger, then that becomes your perception and your reality of people who are experiencing pain. So let's talk about the other more prominent emotions of depression, of being burned out, exhaustion, fear, and constant anxiety. So that's another thing. And validate. Let them know that it's okay. Don't fall for gaslighting, that what you're experiencing is you're grossly out of proportion to things that are happening. It's not. This is a daily occurrence, and children need to know.
I want to thank you all so much for joining this incredible discussion and sharing your views and your perspectives. Everyone here obviously has such an important role to play here, and we look back a year and
Robert, could I know you're trying to close this out, but Pat's got such a tremendous question. I'm asking for Los Angeles to be part of that change, to join in this effort, to all of us join together, whether it's a stakeholder, to educate yourself, to understand that the gaslighting, the misinformation that's out there, we live in such a society of misinformation. But young people, old people, all of us have a responsibility, a shared responsibility for the future of the city. Let's join together.
And Chief, I want to say that we acknowledge that there's a participant that's not here tonight. I want to say, when you feel that someone doesn't understand you, that's probably the most humiliating factor there is. When we talk about empathy, if it were truly wearing someone else's shoes, let's just start there. How many people, non-Black people, would want to be Black in America? I mean, let's start there as understanding what we are experiencing daily as a people. So when you don't think others have the capacity to understand you, that's kind of a hopeless scenario. So, we talk about someone not being here, but I think we also have to be empathic on why they're not here.
Thanks so much for watching, everybody.